Hey everybody, this is a video looking at the best settings and options for the Nikon Z6. These are the settings and options that I use based on the types of photography that I shoot, and also the settings I've been using in my Nikon Z6 for the past 3 to 4 months. People obviously use their cameras in different ways, so you might want to change the settings slightly, but hopefully will still give you a good understanding of how these settings work. This video is designed for people who already have their Z6 in hand. If you do find this video useful, then please do let me know in the comments, and also by hitting that like button as well. Also, some settings we will go through very quickly and others we will spend a bit more time on. So if you do need to, please feel free to pause the video anytime and go back and go over different settings if you didn't quite understand them the first time. Okay, so let's make a start. We are going to start in the photo shooting menu. You access this by pressing the menu button on your Z6 and then head over to the little camera icon, and that will take you to the photo shooting menu. The first option that you see will say reset photo shooting menu. This does exactly what it says on the tin. If you want to reset the entire menu, it will reset the menu back to factory settings. Okay, so the next option down is storage folder. This is where you can rename the storage folder on your memory card. Currently it's set to NCZ_6. You can also choose a folder number and look at any existing folders that are on your card. You can see here I have both a Z6 and a Z7 folder on this memory card because I've used it across both cameras. So next we have file naming, and this is where you can go in and change the name of your files and the pictures that your camera takes. DSC is the standard name, and some people change this to their initials, for example. Next we have choose image area. This is a particularly important setting because it can affect your picture quality. The options that you'll see are FX, this is full frame, the best picture quality. DX is cropped, this will then be APS-C. You can also then shoot square 1:1 and then widescreen 16:9. For the best picture quality I always choose FX, and I can then crop this later in post if I need to. Image quality is the next setting down, and this is another important setting. This is where we choose if our camera shoots in RAW or JPEG. You can choose to shoot RAW and JPEG, and if you want the best of both, I would choose RAW and JPEG Fine Star. You can then just choose your camera to shoot in just RAW, if you want it to just shoot just single RAW files. And you can also then just ask your camera to shoot in single JPEG files, so you would choose JPEG Fine Star or JPEG Fine. Right down at the bottom we then have TIFF as well if you want to shoot in that file format. Image size is the next option down, and this is where you choose the number of megapixels you use. It's split into JPEG and TIFF, so you can choose then large, medium and small for JPEG files of 24 million, 13 million or 6 million. And then you can choose that same size for RAW files, so RAW files in 24 million, 13 million or 6 million pixels. Personally, I always want to set these to 24 million pixels, and I can then crop the size down later on using software. Next up we have RAW recording. In here you'll see two options first of all, RAW compression and then RAW bit depth. We're going to look at compression first of all, and in there you'll see three options. You have lossless compressed, compressed and uncompressed. Personally, I choose uncompressed. This is the largest file size and best picture quality. Lossless compressed will give you a smaller file size, still a RAW file, and compressed gives you 50% smaller file size. You then have RAW bit depth. You have the option between 12-bit and 14-bit. 14-bit contains more data and more color, but it cuts down the camera's frames per second rate. So keep that in mind, but I generally choose 14-bit over 12-bit. Moving on to ISO sensitivity settings. This is probably one of the most important settings in your camera. In here, you can obviously choose your camera's ISO sensitivity. You can also turn on auto ISO. You can then set a maximum sensitivity for that auto ISO as well. When you want to choose your camera's ISO sensitivity, you can go into the option and then choose from 100 all the way up to 51,000 if you need to go that high. If you do have auto ISO sensitivity control turned on, you want to make sure your ISO sensitivity is set to 100. This will act as a lower benchmark, and it will then go all the way up to your maximum sensitivity, which you can set to 51,000. I think the Z6 has amazing noise performance, so I'm happy to use it up to 51,000, but you might not be so keen to do that, so you can set in a lower maximum if you need to. White balance is up next, and this is pretty straightforward if you shoot RAW, because you can change it to whatever you want afterwards using software. You'll see that when you go into white balance, you have auto white balance, which is what I leave my camera in most of the time. You can then choose from preset white balances, everything from cloudy, shady, if you wanted to. One thing that a lot of people don't know is that you can actually adjust the auto. So if you go into auto, you'll then see three settings: auto 0, auto 1, and auto 2. And these adapt how the automatic works to warm or cold environments. I personally prefer it to be set to auto 0 because I prefer colder images. Next we have set picture control, and this is where you can change your camera's picture control, which might adjust how it sees certain colors, if it shoots in black and white. The big thing about these options are that they only affect JPEG images. So we have standard, neutral, vivid, monochrome, portrait, landscape, and flat. And in the Z6 we also have these new creative picture controls that are like creative filters for your pictures that might add different colors or different tones. Because these options only affect JPEG images, I generally tend to leave this in standard, but if I did shoot primarily JPEG images, then I might want to use these settings to adjust the vividness of my pictures or the amount of color they see, and I can also fine-tune each one of these picture controls as well. Select the picture control you want to adjust and then press Right, and you'll see this new adjustment page where you can adjust things like brightness, sharpness, and clarity. You can adjust any of the picture controls in your camera to your liking so that you can get the exact color, sharpness, and detail out of your JPEG images. Below that is Manage Picture Control. This is just a very simple setting where you can save your picture control settings to your memory card, and you can also load in old picture controls from older cameras. Up next is color space. Now there's tons of information online as to which color space is correct for you to use, depending on if you're uploading online or if you're printing, that type of thing. But generally depends on other equipment that you're using, other printers that you are using. I personally use Adobe RGB. It is a larger color spectrum, but when I'm uploading images to online websites or things like that, I might often have to transfer them back to sRGB because they will be compressed, and sometimes you might get incorrect colors. So this is a very personal thing with color space, so make sure you do a bit more research to decide if sRGB or Adobe RGB is better for you. Active delighting is a setting that can help you with situations that have extreme highlight or dark shadows in. You can set this to extra high, high, normal, or low, or off. I generally have this set to off because I shoot RAW, therefore I want to adjust my highlights and shadows at the post-processing stage. If you shoot JPEG, this can be useful to use in high dynamic range situations. In that instance, you would set it to high or extra high. Long exposure noise reduction is an absolute must setting for me. You can have this setting turned on all the time, and it will only automatically kick in once you do an exposure that's longer than 1 second. When it then does a long exposure noise reduction once your exposure is finished. It does, however, double the length of time of your exposure. So if you shoot for a 10-second exposure, that now will take you 20 seconds to complete, but the picture quality is much better and contains much less long exposure noise. This is an absolute must setting for landscape photography. Next is high ISO noise reduction. I generally have this set to low because I generally prefer to do a lot of my noise reduction in post. If you have this set to high, you would obviously have less noise in your images, but you would also then have less detail at high ISO shooting. So keep that in mind, but I prefer to have it set to low so I can edit more of it later. Vignette control I would have set to normal or low or off, depending on if you're shooting RAW or JPEG. I shoot RAW so it has no effect, so I'm not concerned about what this setting is set to. If you shoot JPEG, I'd set it to normal or low, depending on how much vignette you want to be in your images or not. Diffraction compensation is a setting that's new to Nikon cameras, and it has only been available in the Z6 and Z7 so far. I personally have this turned off. A, because I shoot raw and I'd prefer to fix it in post, and also because I never shoot at apertures that cause diffraction anyway. I never shoot anything higher than f11. Anything higher than that generally tends to give you softer images because diffraction starts to kick in. Auto distortion control is another setting that only affects JPEG images. So normally I have this turned off, but if you're primarily a JPEG shooter, I would leave this on. Flicker reduction shooting is particularly useful if you're shooting indoors. The camera can detect flickering in lights, and it can match high frames per second to match that flickering. I personally don't shoot indoors a lot, so I don't have this setting on, and I'd rather have my camera fire at its full frames per second. But for high frames per second work indoors, this setting can be useful. Metering is an option that's pretty important to your camera because it changes how the camera sees the light that is in front of it. Now, when you go into metering, you will have 4 different options. Those options are matrix metering, center weighted metering, spot metering, and highlight weighted spot metering. I generally have my camera in matrix metering 99% of the time. It meters for the entire scene that's in front of the camera, and it generally always gives me a good average between my highlights and my shadows. I never use center weighted metering. My subject is very rarely in the center of the frame. Spot metering is useful for wildlife photography because I can bring out or meter for a particular area of shadow, maybe under a bird in flight, for example. Another good use for spot metering would be theater photography. If you have subjects stood on a stage being shined on by a spotlight, it would mean that the camera is only exposing or metering for that spotlighted area. Highlight weighted metering does what it says, and it keeps a highlight as a highlight. This is particularly useful for weddings. A white dress, for example, might want to be underexposed by a camera in a different metering option, whereas in highlight weighted metering it will keep it as a white, bright highlight. You'll notice that flash control is grayed out in the menu and you're unable to go and access this part of the menu. This option will only become available if you have the Nikon WRR10 plugged into the side of your Z6. At that point you can then use this to trigger wireless speedlights such as the SB5000. Flash mode allows you to change how the flash fires when you are using a flash with your Z6. The options are fill flash, red eye reduction, rear curtain sync, and then you can actually turn the flash system off if you wanted to. But again, obviously the camera has no built-in flash, so this is with external flashes or speedlights only. Next we have focusing mode. Now I'm only going to go over this very briefly. I don't want to take a whole hour just talking about focusing options. But inside focusing mode, you will see that you have 3 different options. They are AFS, AFC, and manual focus. AFS is single autofocus. The camera will only focus once on a subject. If the subject moves or if you move tough, it's probably out of focus. AF continuous allows the camera to continuously track or follow a moving subject, and this requires you to then hold the AF on button or the shutter button down to make sure the camera continuously focuses, and then manual focus puts the camera into manual focus. Next is focusing area mode, and this is where it gets a bit more complicated. The options you have are pinpoint AF, single point, dynamic area, wide area, small and large, and then you have an auto area. Now, some of them work better for different types of photography. Personally, I've been finding myself switch between single point, dynamic area, wide area, small, and then auto area. So pretty much all of them depend on the type of photography that I'm shooting. I will be doing a much more in-depth video on autofocusing later, so keep an eye out for that. But for now, a quick summary would be pinpoint for macro close-up detail, single point for landscapes and portraits, dynamic area for sports, wildlife, and also then wide area for sports and wildlife, and auto area for face tracking and video. Next option is pretty straightforward. We have vibration reduction. This is to do with the camera's in-body stabilization. We can choose normal, sport, or off. Generally I have this set to normal for most of the time. If my camera is on a tripod doing a long exposure, then I set it to off, and the camera will actually lock the in-body stabilization in place so there's no movement on a long exposure picture. If you're using an f-mount lens that has vibration reduction built in, then this option will be grayed out, and to turn the VR off you can do that by using the switch on the side of the VR lens. Okay, so next up we have auto bracketing. Now in here you can see that you can first of all choose the auto bracketing set. This can be auto exposure and flash, just auto exposure, just flash, white balance, and also active delighting. Once you've decided what it is you want to bracket, you can then choose the number of shots and also then the increment, so it might be 1 stop or 2 stops. Okay, so the options remaining in this menu are pretty complicated, so I'm planning on covering those in a different video going forward. Okay, so for this next part we're going to move over to the movie shooting menu. Okay, so this menu is all about your camera's video recording settings. If you're not interested in video, you can skip this section. So the first setting we're going to look at is choose image area, and in here you will have FX and DX, and this is pretty straightforward. It's whether or not you want to record video using the full frame FX sensor or shooting in crop DX. The next setting we're going to look at is frame size and frame rate. Choosing the correct frame size and frame rate for your video is extremely important, as it makes a huge difference to the look of your video but also the quality in which it's recorded in. There are a lot of different options in this setting. The three options that say 3840 by 2160 are all 4K video recording options. Your camera can record 4K in 30 frames, 25 frames or 24 frames per second. 1920 by 1080 is also known as Full HD. You'll notice that when you're recording in Full HD, your camera can record in 120 frames per second, 100 frames per second, 60, 50, 30, 25 or 24. When you select 120 frames per second or 100 frames per second, the camera will record normally with audio, but then the footage can be slowed down to give you slow motion video at a later date. If you want slow motion video straight out of camera, you'll notice that there's 3 slow motion options at the bottom of the list. You can have 4 times or 5 times slow motion. However, these options will not record audio. If you just want to do normal video recording, I would choose 4K at 30 frames per second, and if I wanted to record in Full HD, I would also choose Full HD at 30 frames per second. If you've chosen to record in 4K, then the movie quality option will be grayed out. However, if you have chosen to record in Full HD, make sure this option is set to high, as out of the box it's set to normal. Choosing high will give you a better video quality. Next up, you can choose movie file type, and there's 2 options, MOV or MP4. MOV is a slightly higher quality video file format, whereas MP4 is more universal. Next, we have ISO sensitivity settings, and this is where we can control how the ISO works during our video recording. So first of all, you can choose a maximum sensitivity. With the Z6, I'll happily let it go up to 51,000. Very rarely will it need to go that high in video, but I leave it there just in case. If you need to, you can also go and choose the settings of high 1 or high 2. These are the expanded ISO settings, and the quality definitely drops when using these settings. Next up, we have white balance. It's more important when it comes to video because it's harder to change in post. Quite often I still do record in auto white balance, but sometimes you will need to go in and put in your own white balance by either using a preset or by adding in your own degrees Kelvin, just to make sure that you have an accurate white balance before you start video recording. Moving on to picture controls, these are another important part of video recording. One picture control that a lot of people like to use when video recording is called flat. What this allows you to do is record more detail in highlights and in shadows, and then when you edit your video in post, you can do something called color grading or grading to bring that detail back into the video. If you're not comfortable doing that or you don't know how to do that, I would recommend recording in a picture control that's set to standard or vivid, depending on how much color you want in your video. You can also grade with something called N-log, which we'll go through later on in this video. Okay, so these next settings, active delighting, high ISO, vignette, diffraction and distortion control, all have the same effect as they do in the stills menu. So we're going to skip past these and we're going to look next at flicker reduction. Flicker reduction can be useful if you don't control your own shutter speed in video. If you're from the UK, you would select 50 Hz. If you're from America, for example, or the United States, you would select 60 Hz, and this would stop lights from flickering across your video. Next up is focus mode. So in here you will see 4 different options. You have AFS, AFC, AFF, and manual focus. And this depends on how you want your camera to obviously focus whilst you're recording video. Personally, I tend to either use AFF or AFC for video. If I'm recording by holding the camera myself, I prefer to use AFC because I can then use the AF on button to activate or deactivate autofocus as I'm filming. I might want it to stop autofocusing for some particular reason, and I can do that by simply letting go of the AF on button whilst recording. However, if I have the camera on a tripod and I am recording myself in front of the camera and I've got no way of touching the camera and interacting with it, I will then be in AFF, and this means that the camera will focus all of the time continuously and I don't have to keep touching or having any interaction with the camera whatsoever. If you were going to be recording something that was static, then you could put the camera into AFS and focus on it and just record, and then the camera will not refocus at all because the subject is static, it's not going to move. Okay, so after focus mode we then have AF area mode, and you'll see that again you have 4 different options in here. So we have single point, wide area small, and wide area large, and then auto area. If I'm recording myself in front of the camera, I'm generally always in auto area because that's the one that contains face tracking and face detection. The camera will then automatically track my face wherever it moves within the scene and keeps me in focus. If I'm recording other people, then I'd still be in auto area, so I can still make use of the face detection. If I'm not recording people, say I'm recording a scene or a building or a landscape, I might then consider going to single point or wide area small. Next we have vibration reduction, and this works the same way as it does in pictures, but obviously now for video. And this is using the camera's in-body stabilization system. One thing that is different for video is electronic VR. In electronic VR you only have 2 options, on or off. If you turn this on, what it will do is it applies a very small crop around the outside of your video, and it will then use that crop to stabilize the footage electronically. Some people like this and see it as an advantage. Some people don't like the effect it has on the video. So if you haven't ever tried this before, it could be worth making some example footage, seeing how it affects your footage, and if you're happy with the stabilization that it gives you, use it. If not, turn it off, and you can do electronic stabilization in post in video editing stage. Next is microphone sensitivity, and this is massively subjective to how you want your microphone to work. If you just want ease of use, then leave it in auto. But if you are concerned about audio quality and you might even be using an external microphone that plugs straight into the camera, I'd recommend choosing a manual sensitivity. But if you are recording something that is unpredictable and you don't know if the sound is going to go up or down aggressively, then you would still put it into auto sensitivity. The next setting is attenuator. You can either have this enabled or disabled. This is useful if you are using an external microphone and you are sure of what your audio levels are going to be. It will make your audio input quieter, but it will help in terms of reducing background noise. If you don't know what you're doing with external microphones or with audio, I would generally leave this off. But if you do know what you're doing with your audio, then an attenuator is a useful feature to have. Next we have frequency response. This is pretty straightforward. If you're doing a face-to-face interview, you could use vocal range, and if you were recording a scene or your surroundings, you could use wide to make sure it covers all of the sounds in your surroundings. Wind noise reduction is something I generally tend to have turned off. I'd much rather protect the microphone from wind by using something physical like a ball of fluff around the microphone itself or a sponge casing. Okay, so we're now going to move on to the custom settings menu. There are a lot of settings in this menu. Some of them are really important and we will need to change, and some of them we can leave as they are. We'll start by looking at the camera's auto-focusing options. In autofocus you'll see the first option says AFC priority selection. You have 2 options here, release and focus. This should be set to release. This means that when I'm using the camera in AFC continuous autofocus, when I push the shutter button, the camera will fire. And that means I can shoot whenever I want, regardless if the image is in focus or not. If I have it set to focus, what might happen is the camera might think the shot's out of focus and it will stop me from firing. This is not something I want to have because I want to be able to shoot when I want to shoot when I push the button, not when the camera tells me because it thinks something is in or out of focus. The next option down is AFS priority selection. And again, I have two options here, release and focus. I often set this one to focus because if I'm in AFS, I've slowed myself down and I want to make sure the camera's in focus before I take the shot. Next, we have focus tracking with lock on. This determines what the camera does if it's following a subject and then something blocks the subject, so something becomes between you and your subject that you're tracking. If you have this set to quick, it will refocus quickly on the new subject. If you have this set to delayed, it will ignore the new subject and stay on the existing subject. If you are unsure as to which one would be best for your type of photography, leave this on 3. I generally change this from 1 to 5 depending on the subjects that I'm shooting. Next is auto area AF face detection. You have a choice here of on or off. This should be turned on, otherwise your camera will not have face detection. You effectively turn face detection off with this setting. Next up is focus points used. If you select all, then this obviously gives you control over all of the focusing points the camera has. If you select half, every other point, then that halves the number of points that are selectable to you. This means that it will be quicker to go from left to right or move around the focusing points, but it might mean that you might not get the point in the correct position. I often leave this in all points unless I need to move my focusing point around extremely quickly. Next up is store by orientation. This is pretty straightforward. You have a yes or no question. If you set this to yes, store by orientation is then turned on. What this does is it remembers the location you last used your focusing point in when you were shooting vertical and horizontal. So if you move between vertical and horizontal often, it will revert the AF point back to the position you last used it when you were last shooting portrait or horizontal. Moving on to AF activation. This is a pretty important setting, especially if you want to turn your camera into back button focus. Back button focus is a wonderful technique and a wonderful way of focusing, especially if you are a wildlife photographer or a sports photographer. In AF activation, you'll see that you have two settings. One is shutter and AF on, and this will allow you to autofocus by using the shutter button and the AF on button. If you want to just use the AF on button only as back button focus, you would then select AF on only. This, however, will mean that your shutter button will no longer work in terms of focus. It will only be used to take a picture, so your camera will no longer focus from the shutter button. This can be a bit of a learning curve and you might find that you forget that you've turned the shutter button focusing off. Next up we have limit AF area mode selection. This is where you can go in and actually turn off some of the AF area modes, and this means that you will no longer be able to access them unless you come back into this menu. You simply untick them and they will no longer be visible as an option when you're trying to change them quickly in the camera. This can be an advantage because if you know you're never going to use pinpoint, for example, or if you might think you'll never use dynamic area, then you can turn them off and they'll never then pop up when you want to quickly change them in the camera's menu. I do recommend that you don't turn anything off until you've tested all of the different options and you know which ones you're going to use and which ones you're not going to use. Next up is focus point wraparound. This should be turned on. This is one of my favorite settings. What it allows you to do when it is turned on and set to wrap is if your focusing point is right to the left hand side of the screen, you press left and it will then wrap around and appear on the right, or if it's right at the top you press up and it will then wrap around and appear at the bottom. It's a great way of moving from one side of the screen to the other when you're moving your focusing points around quickly. Next up is focus point options. There's two options in this menu. You have manual focus mode. You'd want this to be turned on, so what this does is when you are manually focusing, the autofocus will give you an assist and it will confirm to say yes it's sharp or it thinks it's soft. And then you have dynamic area AF assist. What this will do when you're in the dynamic mode is it gives you the outer area of the dynamic mode, and this is displayed by dots. If you have this turned off, you won't see those dots. Next up is low light autofocus. Now this is an on or off setting. This should only be turned on if you are using the camera in low light situations. It will make the autofocus slower, but it is more accurate in low light situations. Built-in AF Assist illuminator is again another on or off option, and most of the time I actually have this turned off because it can be quite distracting, especially the bright green light. But if you do want that assist, then you just turn this on. If you don't want it on, you turn it off. We are going to skip through a few options here that aren't as important, and we're going to move down to self-timer next. In self-timer, you'll see that you can add in the self-timer delay. You can also then add in the number of shots that you want it to fire, and then if you want an interval between each of those shots, all from the self-timer command. Next down is power off delay, and this is quite an important setting because this is where you can choose how long the camera stays on for in like a standby mode or in the menus. I often set these to longer numbers, so 30 seconds, a minute, maybe 5 minutes. I'm not too concerned about it affecting battery life because I turn the camera off. It only affects your battery life if you don't turn the camera off. And especially if you get annoyed easily by your camera going into standby mode too often, if you set the standby timer to longer than 30 seconds or a minute, it won't happen as often. Continuous low mode shooting is next, and I set this to 5 frames per second because I want my continuous low to shoot as fast as it can. However, you might want to choose a specific frames per second for a specific speed of shooting. Next up is max continuous release. What this is for is just in case you leave the camera on, put it in the bag, and then something sits or pushes on the shutter button, how many shots the camera will fire continuously before it automatically stops itself. I actually set this to 100 so that if it does randomly start firing on its own in the bag, it doesn't fire 200 shots randomly of the inside of my bag. Next up is one of my favorite settings, and this is called exposure delay mode. I use this for my long exposure landscape photography. If I don't have a remote with me, I can add in up to a 3-second delay before the camera takes the shot. This helps for any reduction in vibration or anything that might be moving in the camera itself. It's a great way to shoot the camera when you're shooting long exposures, so it's a must setting to have turned on when you're shooting landscapes. And I have this set to 3 seconds. However, you do have to remember to turn it back off once you've finished using it. I use this so much that I have it assigned to one of my function buttons. The next setting down is another useful feature for long exposure landscape photography. This is electronic front curtain shutter. You have enable or disable. If you enable this, then the front curtain movement of your exposure will be done electronically, and therefore there is no mechanical movement causing vibrations during your long exposure. Next up is limit selectable image area, and again, if you know that you're never going to shoot in 1:1 or 16:9, you can untick these options and therefore they won't come up when you choose that option in the menu. Apply settings to live view is a very important setting. If you have this turned on, the camera will take the settings that you've asked it to shoot with, say 200th of a second, the f4 or ISO 100, and it will show you the effect that will give you on your exposure. That might be too dark for certain situations, or it might be too bright for certain situations. If you have this turned off, the camera will just show you a constant exposure that will always remain the same, no matter what your settings are set to. Framing grid display is a nice easy setting. You turn it on, you get a nice framing grid on your camera's display, and if you turn it off, you don't. The next setting down is peaking highlights. This is where you can choose your peaking sensitivity level, and you can choose from 1, 2, or 3. 3 is high sensitivity, and that means that everything that's in focus will be shown as highlighted. And then 1 is low sensitivity, so it only shows you the absolute critical sharpness areas of your shot. You can also then choose the color of your peaking highlight, so red, yellow, blue, or white. View all in continuous mode should be set to on. If it's set to off and you ask your camera to shoot at a high rate of frames per second, the screen will just go blank and you won't be able to see anything when you're shooting in continuous shooting mode, so this should generally be turned on. Next up is flash sync speed, and this is a very simple change. You want to go into this menu and select 1/200th of a second and then auto FP. This will now allow you to shoot using autofocal plane high speed sync with Nikon flashes, and this means that you can shoot all the way up to 8,000th of a second whilst using Nikon speedlights. Next, we're going to skip a few settings and head down to Customize iMenu. This is a great setting, and the Z6 and the Z7 are the first cameras that allow you to customize their iMenu. You can choose from a large range of different settings, and you can build them into the menu that pops up when you push your I button. This is a great way of building a quick access menu of all of your most used settings. This is something that I'd recommend going through and looking at intently, making sure that all of your most used settings are going to be in your iMenu. Next up is custom control assignment, and this is how you customize your function buttons. So function 1 and 2, AF on. There's a range of different options that you can choose from and you can assign to the buttons. So again, make sure you spend some time making sure that the exact options that you want to be set to each button is set that way that you want it. The next option is the OK button setting, and one of the things I always like to do is make sure I go into playback mode, zoom on and off, and then make sure it zooms 1 to 1. This means that when I'm in playback and I press the OK button, it will zoom 1 to 1 on my picture and I can check my sharpness. Next, we're going to scroll down until you see it says Customize iMenu again, but now this is a separate iMenu, and this will be when you're shooting video, not stills. So you can now go in and customize this iMenu with all of the settings that you would need for video rather than photography. You also then have custom control assignment again, and this is for the controls when you're in video, not for photography. So again, you can set your buttons to different options when you're recording video. The next setting we're going to move on to is AF speed. This affects the AF speed when in video only, and you'll see that you can have slower or faster options. This depends on how quickly it will move from point to point, so if it registers a new subject. Slower means it gives you smoother transition of focus, which you might want for video, and faster would mean it would move from point to point much faster, but then it's not going to be as smooth. So it depends on the focusing effect that you want in your video. The next option down is AF tracking sensitivity. You can have this set to high sensitivity or low sensitivity, depending on how frequently you want it to monitor and track a moving subject. High means that it tracks a moving subject that's moving more erratically, and low, it might miss a subject or lose a subject if it moves quite quickly. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the custom settings menu. We are now going to move on to the setup menu. This is the menu with the little spanner icon. First option that you'll see in this menu is format memory card. You should always format a memory card in the camera. Formatting a memory card will delete everything that is on there, so obviously make sure there's nothing important on there before you do a format, but always make sure your memory cards that you're using have been formatted in the camera before you use them. Next you have Save User Settings, and this is how you make use of U1, U2 and U3 on the mode dial on the top of your camera. You input all of the settings that you want to store, shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and all the settings in the menus, and then you choose to save it to U1, U2 or U3, and then when you change that mode dial to U1, that's the settings you will be given. Next we're going to skip down a few settings and we're going to talk about AF fine tune. Now normally in a mirrorless camera you don't need AF fine tune, so this option is still in the system for when you're using f-mount lenses, just in case you need to fine tune any of the f-mount lenses, and especially older f-mount lenses that you're using on your Nikon Z6 or Z7. Speaking of older lenses, non-CPU lens data is the menu you need to use if you're going to be using non-electronical lenses. This is a way for you to tell your camera what the focal length of the lens that you're using is and also what its maximum aperture is. This will then allow the camera to compensate its exposure based on what your aperture setting is and also what the focal length is. Great for when using non-electronical f-mount lenses or other lenses that are f-mount but don't have electronical connections in them. Next we're going to skip down to image comment, and this is where you can attach a specific comment to each of your images in the metadata. This is great if you're shooting for a specific client, or if you have a batch of photos that are from a holiday, you can all have each of those images with the same comment attached to them. Great for searching through a huge library of files. You can also attach copyright information in the option further down, and this is where you can attach the artist, which might be yourself as the photographer, and then attach your own copyright, and this will be stored to the metadata of each of your images. A few options down, you'll see an option that says HDMI, and if you then go into that option and select Advanced, this is where you can choose your Z6's bit depth and also choose if it shoots in N-Log. This is something I was talking about earlier where you can get more detail and better picture quality out of your videos, but you do need to use an external recorder to record in N-Log and 10-bit. Skipping to the next setting we're going to look at is airplane mode. This is extremely useful for saving battery life. I have airplane mode turned on all the time unless I'm using the Wi-Fi or the Bluetooth specifically, so it's something I recommend having enabled unless you're using it. If you want to connect your camera to a smart device like a phone or a tablet, you need to download an application called SnapBridge. If you want to connect your camera directly to your PC, then you have to go through a couple of steps first, and there's a bit of software that you need to install on your PC or Mac first of all. I do have a video already explaining this procedure. If you haven't watched that already, I've dropped a link in the description below, and I'll also put a link up in the corner of the video so that you can click that if you do need to connect your camera to a computer via Wi-Fi. And there we are, we're all set up. Thank you very much for watching. I can't believe you've made it to the end of this video. Hopefully I've not bored you too much. I hope you do get some really good shots with your Z6. And if you do have any questions, please do put them in the description below. Please do subscribe. Thank you very much for watching.